Good morning, everybody. Good morning to our friends in India zone, Singapore, and Far East in Australia, New Zealand. And good evening to our speakers, Mamadou and Robby Simpson. Sorry, good morning. So we are into the 7th session of webinar on R10 Talk, and that is on distributed energy, standards on distributed energy. We have today Mr. Srikant Chandrasekharan from IEEE India office, who is the senior director there. May I request him to start the session and moderate it till the end. Over to Chandrasekharan.
Thank you, Sanjay, and thank you, Daniel. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Region 10 for considering a series of webinars and workshops in 2023 focused around standardization and industry engagement. Some of you who joined us in the earlier session might recall that we did a introductory session on standards about 2 or 3 months back in April. And this is a series of about 4 webinars. We are doing second one on the industry and standards engagement. And today we have 2 excellent speakers, and we thought that we will focus on distributed energy resources, the interconnectivity, and the communication. So, as part of that, we have Mamadou, Diong, and Robby Simpson, and I'm proud to call them my friends and great colleagues at IEEE. They have done some excellent work in both these areas, and I'm sure that the next 1.5 hours will be a great session of what's happening in the standardization world, particularly with respect to distributed energy resources through 1547 and 2030.5 that we'll be focusing on today. There is, it's a one-way broadcast, so people will not be able to probably say something, but you always have the chat feature and the Q&A, so that if you want to pose a question, you please keep sending them along, and I will try to cover as much as possible at given the time available at the end of the session. We have kept about 20 to 30 minutes. So without much further ado, I'm going to introduce both the speakers. First, I will introduce Mamadou Diong, and he is the one going to talk about 1547 first. He is a supervisor for Dominion Energy's electric distribution technical operations, leading a team of engineers and technicians working, among others, on DER commissioning, witness testing, intelligent electronic devices, maintenance, as well as any related grid modernization projects. Mamadou has about 14 plus years of experience working in the energy industry. He is also a member of the 1547 Education and Credentialing Program Utility Advisory Board. But for more importantly, in today's session, he has been serving as Dominion Energy's SME for IEEE Standard 1547 and is currently the Secretary of 1547.2, which is a revision of IEEE Guide for Standard IEEE 1547, as well as the incoming chair for the revision of IEEE Standard 1547-2018 working groups. I don't think its incoming chair is the current chair, so I guess that's a mistake there on my behalf. So the next one, I would like to introduce Robby Simpson, Dr. Robby Simpson, who is the principal and co-founder of Enetrix, where he creates innovative software and tools for distributed energy resources. Robby has been engaged in grid modernization for several years, particularly in the areas of distributed energy resources, AMI metering, and demand response, and has been heavily involved in accelerating standards for smart grid interoperability. Robby is active in IEEE. He is a former member of the IEEE SA Board of Governors, and he was also the chair and is the chair of the IEEE 2030.5. He has also been engaged in IEC and IETF. Through these efforts, he not only helps to accelerate standards development, but also ensures the adoption of those standards within Enetrix and the market as a whole. So I just gave only a brief remarks on their bios. So their bios are available. So if you want to get more details, you can read them. But with that, I also want to thank the speakers. It is a late evening their time in the United States, so I appreciate it. We wanted to make sure that we make it convenient for our audience, which is mainly the Region 10. And I know that it's a little bit early for folks in India, and as we go east, it becomes slightly better. So with that, Mamadou, I'm going to hand it over to you to go talk about the IEEE 1547.
Daniel to make some opening remarks.
Oh,
Daniel.
sorry. Go ahead, Daniel, before we hand it over to Mamadou.
Thank you. So I will keep it short. Good morning and good evening to our distinguished speakers. My name is Daniel Iqbal. I'm the Manager Future Network Strategy here in Australia, Queensland, and I work in the distribution company here. I also serve as the Professional Activity Chair with Region 10. So as Siri mentioned, this seminar is part of the series of seminars we run on IEEE standards. But this one, I'm particularly keen and excited to hear from the distinguished speakers on these two standards on DER. If you follow the energy transition across Region 10, different countries have got different plans and speeds and targets, but we are all working towards the same target, which reduce the emission, and transition to renewable is obviously the key solution. If I were to spare a coin for every time that I have heard IEEE 2030.5 in different meetings in Australia in the past 3 years, from when you talk to the regulators or other you're sitting with engineers, I think I would have had at least $1 million saving by now. So this is how important these standards are, and this is how we help the industry to make sure that we develop solutions that you can roll out across the world and not entirely in one particular power system. So I'm pretty sure that you'll find a lot of information today, but just keep in mind that this session is introductory to the standards, and this is an opportunity to create and encourage you to get involved and connect with the community of DR professionals, and IEEE can provide that to you. So with that, I will stop there and hand it over to our distinguished speakers to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, and over to you, Mamadou.
Very much, Daniel, Shri, and Sanjay. And for the sake of saving bandwidth, I'm going to cut off the video until the Q&A session, if you don't mind. Again, thank you very much. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Shri. Let me know if you're able to see it.
It's coming up. Perfect. You are all set to go, Mamadou.
Okay. So I'm going to also try to stop the video just a little bit. Again, once again, good morning for those of you who are in the Asian area, and good evening for those who are here earlier. Thank you again for inviting me for this talk and this discussion. Again, my name is Mamadou, and I wanted to take a little bit of time, although I know Shri did a great job presenting, giving me a bio. I have actually a slide giving a quick summary of all of those that you said in a few bullets. Hopefully that's going to be helpful. I have, starting this year, about 15 plus years of experience in the utility industry, and also been with the company, Dominion Energy, which is an electric distribution transmission company, for about 14 years. As Shri said, I'm a chair of the 1547 standard and secretary for 1547. That too. I've been involved with 1547 pretty much for 11 years now, since 2012. A lot of valuable experience that I gained there, and a lot of things I learned also from peers and everyone, including Shri and all the distinguished guests in this call. Now, before we dive deep into the 1547 standard, I wanted to just pause quickly and just discuss a little bit why really standards are important to us. Typically, IEEE standard are started when there's a need for an idea or concept of standardization. And 1547, that standard is part of the IEEE SA standard board, especially under the SC21, which is a standard coordinating committee, which deal with biofuel and other standards, to name a few, solar and Also, they deal with a standard like 2030.5, which deal with microgrid and other innovative technologies. Just wanted to give you a little bit of background on that. So what's good in the standard is that we always try to gain consensus. So everything that we put in a standard is due to a consensus that was reached. And consensus from people from different backgrounds, from utility, from academia, from the industry, all coming together for the good of the industry, also for the good of our colleagues, to make sure that there's predictable ways of designing systems like solar system or any other system you can name of. Again, just wanted to give you a quick background on that before I dive deep into the discussion on 1547. Now, with regard to 1547, 1547 actually is not just one standard. 1547 has also a different series of standards. Among those, as you can see in this slide, we have, first of all, standard. Those standards are documents that are specifying requirements that are mandatory. They will typically say shall. Then 1547 also has some other series of standards that provide recommended practice. So in this case, we tell them this is the preferred way of doing X, Y, Z. And typically you will see a lot of times they will say should do this or should do that. Then also there's guides, other series of standards that are typically guides, as very much explaining and helping people understand how to apply some standard like the standard 1547. And you can see here 1547.10 is a recommended practice, which I will touch a little bit later in the presentation. 1547.2, which I'm the secretary, is a guide to understanding 1547 itself. And hopefully that's helpful. And I mentioned earlier the Standard Coordinating Committee, so fuel cell, photovoltaic, dispersed generation, energy storage, all of those are under the purview of the Standard Standard Committee 21. And again, just giving you a little bit of background. With that in mind, I'm going to start now the discussion on 1547 and all the associated standard that I showed you a little bit. Now, why 1547? 1547, again, is a standard for interconnection and interoperability of distributed energy resources with the electric power system and interfaces. So what it means is that this standard is essentially providing criteria requirement for interconnection of those DER with the electric power system. Those include anything that's relevant to performance, operation, testing, safety consideration, and also maintaining the DER interconnection to make sure it's actually helping the utility instead of hurting it. So just to give you a few examples of items that the standard is handling. The standard, for instance, goes into providing technical guidance, technical specification on performance. It could be also how you should be providing reactive power. What are the capabilities that you should be having? Are those capabilities the minimum that you should have? Now, there's a lot of consideration in the standard also of what type of technology you're using, while also ensuring that we have technology neutrality in everything we do in that standard. So those requirements, for instance, for power control, for making sure that you behaved in the right way for abnormal condition, or how you maintain power quality, all of those are done with regard to the technology you're dealing with. And again, all those criteria that's in the standard 1547, although it has a requirement that a lot of DER manufacturers are following to the letter, the criteria are still the purview of the EPS owner, again, meaning the electric power system or the grid owner, or people who are implementing or putting requirement on how to implement those standards in your electric grid. Again, also the standard, want to remind everyone that those are great items, great consensus that were reached when the standard was written. But at the end of the day, as a utility, if you're a utility provider, for instance, it should be your responsibility to look at other items that may be outside of the scope of the standard. Those could be like safety, security, health, environmental protection, and other laws, or just coordination and planning of your load, for instance, if you are a utility engineer, how you decide how load should be managed. Those are the purview of the utility owner or the regulators. And just wanted to give you that quick background. And I hope this is helpful. Next now, I wanted to continue on giving you more background on 1547. 1547 actually started back in 2003. At the beginning, it was mostly focused on distribution only and providing specification for interconnection systems. Everything that was necessary at the time to allow us to achieve the standards objective, which is to safely and reliably connect DER. So essentially, what he, at the time was saying that DER have to meet XYZ standard and they have to be listed. But everything has some limitation. For instance, we couldn't do at the time right through. We couldn't allow the DER to do things like supporting the grid because we didn't have a lot more knowledge and experience at the time on that standard. Now, fast forward in 2018, the standard was much more expanded and more adapted to the current reality, where we have communication interfaces, we have direct interaction between the DER and the area EPS, but also the understanding that the bulk power system may be impacted as well. So the standard 1547 of 2018 went further by revamping the entire standard and recognizing that everything that happened in distribution may impact the bulk power system, recognizing that and making sure that all DER that meet the standard can provide some very important control functionality and some parameters that are believed to be necessary to support the grid. Again, a lot of change from 1547-2003 to the 2018 standard. As a chair, I'm leading actually the standard. I will be talking about that a little later on some revision, incremental revision to make even the standard even better than it used to be. And you can see on the right here some of the new things that came up in the new standard here. 60+ parameters, variably adjustable parameter value, voltage regulation categories, and disturbance categories. Those are new things that you can see in the standard, in addition to the expansion of the scope of the standard. And again, hopefully this is helpful. Next now, I wanted to come back a little bit to the standard series I mentioned earlier. We have recommended practices. We have also guides. 1547-2018, when it came out, we did an amendment to modify items that the industry found were necessary. But other than that, we have 1547.1, which is a testing standard. That standard essentially dictates what testing lab that you, like UL, Intertech, CSA, use to determine if an equipment meets the 1547 standard. Then 1547.2, which I'm the secretary, provide guidance on how to apply the standard, how to understand why, what is the reasoning behind some of the requirements you find in the standard. And then you have 1547.3, which provide guidance on cybersecurity, which is something that everyone had the consensus that cybersecurity is going to be something very important when dealing with DER connecting them. 1547.4 provide guidance on island system, which we call typically microgrid. And 1547.9 now provide additional guidance for energy storage system. And last but not least, 1547.10 provide guidance on gateway platform associated with DER. And hopefully that's helpful. Next now, I wanted to, again, dig a little deeper on some more items, and hopefully I'm good on time. Just a few items that I wanted to show you. The DAT2, the guide. So again, I mentioned earlier that, and I'm going to skip this slide just for the sake of time. The guide will essentially is very important to everyone, all stakeholders, because there's so many new things that were introduced in the 1547-2018 standard, as I showed earlier. Those new items, those 60+ parameters, all 11 control parameters that we mentioned, the categories, made the application of the standard very complex, which really made it more important for us to put together a guide that will hopefully provide, address some of the unknown, some questions that any user may have, and those users may be utility industry, academia, or even regulators, respective countries and continents. And as you can see here, some of the items that are addressed in the guide. Now, at the end of the day, the guide is the goal of the guide is to, again, provide those technical description and schematic and application guide tool also to be able to help you enhance your understanding of the standard 1547 and be able to use it appropriately. Next, I mentioned 1547.3, which is the guide for cybersecurity. Why is that important? Again, I mentioned that there's our devices, the power electronics that are usually powering solar systems, wind systems, and microgrids are much more intelligent, and they also have the capability of communicating with the outside world. That can bring us or put some exposure for us with people that have bad intention again. So that's why cybersecurity is an item that's important. So this guide, which has been approved, by the way, just a few weeks ago and should be published very soon in the next few months, provide guideline on how to deal with cybersecurity related issues for every DER that are meeting the 1547 standard and beyond. And again, the idea is to focus on updating guidelines for the standard and mitigate all those potential issues. Next now, the .9 standard, 1547.9, again, another series of standards of 1547. This guide is essentially focusing on this time energy storage related items. More and more, we're seeing a lot of energy storage coming to our system, so our system all around the world. Some come as a single application, others come as a application paired with solar systems, and some even come into something that's a little bit more mobile. It could be vehicles that have batteries, electric vehicles. That's one of the reasons why 1547.9 was here, just to kind of help address some of those items. Not also forgetting items like black start, safety, V2G I mentioned earlier. It could be even V1G as well. Voltage and frequency right through, again, just to name a few. Those are all of the host of items that 1547.9 is addressing. Now, you probably wonder why I'm going through all of those different standards. Why I'm talking about .2, .3, .9, and all of those different series of standards. The reason is simple. Those are all the things that the revision that I'm chairing right now to 1547-2018 is trying to put into a newer standard, which is the 1547 revision, which I'm leading. So essentially, as I'm showing in this slide, the standard is going to try to do a few things. There was some amendment that I mentioned at the beginning that were the result of items that the industry found out while applying the 1547-2018 standard that needed to be changed. So we, in the revision that I'm leading, which we hope it will be published in 2026, we'll integrate those. But also we'll find some fixes. While adopting the standard, you find out that things are not workable or items may not work properly. We'll introduce all those fixes, put it there, and fixes also discovered when trying to test those DERs or distributed energy resource equipment to try to certify them to the new standard. Also, the .9 standard I showed earlier, trying to promote some of those things and also remove some languages that could be a barrier to doing vehicle to grid or using your vehicle to even push power into the grid. Things like that, again, just to name a few, and you guys can read on the slide, that's the goal, the initial goal of the revision of the 1547-2018 standard that I'm chairing. And last but not least, and that's probably something that's of big interest to all of you here listening our guest, 50 hertz power system. The U.S. power system is a 60 hertz power system. We recognize that the 1547 standard has so many good material that will be, in our belief, very helpful to the outside world, everyone else outside of America, which is why that we are also, as part of this revision, adding an informative annex that will be showing and explaining how countries like in India or in Africa who wants to adopt the standard can use it in the power system properly and be able to benefit from what the standard is bringing. So that's also part of that revision of that standard. Just so, again, I wanted to give you that FYI. Now, just to give you a little bit of summary of where we are with the revision of the 1547 standard. We started to kick off in January to 2023. In April, we did the first full working group meeting, and we are getting ready to go to the second full working group meeting. And I'm inviting everyone joining this meeting to take advantage and reach out to me or to Shri and our host for additional information on how to be involved. Especially, I would like involvement on the area of the application of the 1547 standard on a 50 hertz system. That would be really of great help. And I'm hoping this is helpful. Next, I wanted to give you a takeaway from some of the items that we discussed earlier. As you saw previously, we had a lot of changes in the standard from 2003 through 2014 when we did an amendment, through 2018 when we had the 2018 standard, to 2020 when we did the amendment to 2018 standard. Now we're doing a revision to the standard because we have to keep up with what's happening in the world and make sure that we're creating standards that can help us maintain the safety and the reliability of the power system while helping keep that system there for the foreseeable future. So that's the reason why we're doing the 1547 revision. And the importance of the other series of standards is also notable, as I mentioned. And we're also doing the same thing, this equivalent of the 1547 standard, which I should note is only a distribution standard. The equivalent of the 1547 on the transmission is actually the 2018 standard, which also is a standard available from full IEEE Standard Association. Now, again, there's a lot of technology changes. Grid forming inverters are becoming a thing now in the industry. And all of those things is what the 1547 activities are trying to capture and make sure that we get together and decide on what's the proper way of standardizing some of those requirements while also being a barrier to technology innovation or any other innovation. And just wanted to make sure, again, we welcome all of you to be involved in the IEEE standard development as whenever possible. And I understand also this time difference could be a challenge, but please reach out to us and we'll do our best to accommodate you. Now, last topic that I wanted to discuss is P1547.10, which is a brand new standard guide that we are working on, which is actually a recommended practice. Why this recommended practice? Because only we recognize that outside of the standard 1547 that I showed you earlier with the graph between the DER and the utility grid, in the middle there is a gateway. There needs to be some standardization of how everything is done in between the gateway, which is right in the middle between the DER and the grid. So IEEE and the Standard Association recognize that we need to ensure that we define that area that's not really tackled right now to provide hopefully more guidance to all end users from all different kind of either academia, regulatory, or anywhere. Now, among those requirements, you will see, again, this is going to be the first of this kind in the industry. We'll provide many of gateway applications, again, functions that utility manufacturer can choose from, hopefully to help make it even more smoother integration between the DER and the utility grid. Also try to provide or help provide detailed requirement for each of those functions. And last but not least, we talk a lot about DERMS, distributed energy resource management systems. How do you enable those? How do you deploy those? How do you integrate all of those with all those systems that you have in place already, DR system and the grid system? Okay, how do you do all? Again, that's what the 1547.10 is attempting to do. And currently the 1547.10, the recommended practice working group is running in parallel with the working group that I'm chairing right now. And hopefully that's helpful. For the summary and final takeaways that I want to give you, again, just like I mentioned earlier, there are many changes in standard underway that will impact how we do interconnection. And some of those are the revision of the 1547 2018 standard, which is the P1547 revision, or the 1547.10. Again, all of those are important standards that try to keep up with all those technology changes and make sure that we have good standards that can help us maintain the safety and reliability of the power system. Those could be related to grid forming inverter, interoperability, cybersecurity, and just to name a few. And why that's important? Because we all have that all of those will have an impact on how we run our power system and how we also ensure that we have proper verification and testing of DER that are connected to our power system. Again, thank you all so very much again for your attention. I'm really looking forward to hearing your question and learning from your experience at the end of this webinar. Again, thank you so very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mamadou. Now I will request Robby Simpson to go ahead with this presentation. I heard that people are unable to post their questions. I hope they are able to use the chat window This is a R10 framework that we are using. So I'm not sure what the challenge is, but hopefully you are able to put questions on the chat window instead of the Q&A window. If there are any challenges, please let Daniel know and I will coordinate it accordingly. Thank you. Over to you, Robby.
So first of all, thank you all for inviting me to talk today. It's a real honor, and I hope you find this interesting and informative. So I'm here to give an overview of the IEEE 2030.5 standard. It's a standard that not only do I chair, I've been involved with it since it was a blank sheet of paper. So I probably have a decent amount of insight to share and could even share some of the war stories, if you will, from the development. Let's see, there we go. So first off, the typical disclaimer: the following presentation is my own and does not necessarily reflect the consensus of IEEE, IEEE SA, P2030.5, etc. But let's just dive right in. So to kind of set the stage here, why is there a need for communications when it comes to these grid applications? Why is there a need for a standard like 2030.5? Well, first off, with the increased penetration that we're starting to see of distributed generation, and things like solar, et cetera, this can really lead to some grid stability issues unless those are managed. And those are managed through standards like IEEE 1547 that Mamadou just discussed, whether you have these autonomous curves, you have various settings and controls, et cetera, that are typically set up originally by, say, an installer. So if you say you have solar, you may have a solar installer that comes and sets these settings in the inverters, but then they leave, of course, and you may find out that those settings are not appropriate for where you're located on the grid, etc. And that's why you need the capability to change these sorts of settings and curves and controls through communications. And so that's more for grid stability and making certain that you're a good citizen, if you will, on the grid. But there's also desires from the actual consumers themselves, or what's often called prosumers now, where they want increased engagement and increased information. They want to know how much energy they're using or producing. They want to know the price of energy, details such as that, and they want to know it through devices that they're familiar with, through their mobile devices, et cetera. And then also communications enable new market models. You can start to really have price responsive um, activities on the grid. You can start to enable aggregation, which I'll get into more, but basically the concept that multiple consumers can aggregate their resources together to participate in markets. And then, of course, one thing to consider is that this equipment is being rapidly installed today. Every day I hear new predictions about the installation of renewables that are quite exciting and always seem to be revising themselves to be more aggressive in terms of the predictions. But a lot of this is being installed today without communications capability. And the concern there is once they're deployed without communications, it's going to be very hard to communicate with them in the future, of course, or to adjust those settings and to deal with the grid stability issues that arise. And so if I have any ask today, it is that you consider communications when you're thinking about the things that are being installed today, so that you'll be able to use it when you need it in the future. And then lastly, interconnection rules and regulations are beginning to require communications. You just heard from Mamadou, the latest IEEE 1547 revision in 2018 requires a DER to support at least one of three choices when it comes to communication technologies: IEEE 2030.5, IEEE 1815, which is often called DNP3, or Sunspec Modbus. And each of those kind of has a particular niche that they specialize. 2030.5 tends to be more consumer-owned devices and internet-focused. DNP3 tends to be more utility-owned devices and SCADA focused. And Sunspec Modbus, it typically is used locally. And then just to use an example that I'm most familiar with, California's Rule 21, which is their interconnection rule. They named IEEE 2030.5 as the quote-unquote default protocol for smart inverter communications. So jurisdictions and rules are beginning to recognize the need for this communication, for these communications, and that's a need that at IEEE 2030.5 in particular is attempts to fill. So interoperability, you hear that word a lot, and it means different things to different people. But I want to talk about why interoperability is crucial in this particular area, in smart grid communications, particularly with consumer-owned or customer-owned equipment. So you've got this customer-owned equipment that's interfacing to the grid. And so you can have a variety of different equipment from a variety of different manufacturers. This equipment is often available in the retail market. And so therefore it's not necessarily specific to a particular jurisdiction. You might get on eBay or something and order a solar inverter. So it's not going to necessarily be a solar inverter that's specific for a particular jurisdiction. And then the communications themselves operate over a variety of medium. And what I mean by that is it can be cellular, it could be Ethernet, Wi-Fi, all sorts of different communications technology. And so it's important that the standards that are used are able to work over a variety of those technology in an interoperable way. And then lastly, the equipment will need to interact in a holistic way. So typically when folks think about standards, it's often very siloed to a functional area, right? We're making an electric vehicle standard, or we're making a solar standard, or we're making a demand response standard. But when it comes to particularly customer-owned equipment, these equipment will interact with one another. Your electric vehicle and your solar and your demand response can all work together to efficiently and effectively manage energy for the consumer, for the grid, etc. And so it's great if these pieces of equipment can all use the same standard in an interoperable fashion to communicate. I want to highlight some differences when it comes to DER ownership in particular, because this, I think, really kind of gets people thinking typically on why there's different standards and where the different standards often fit. So with utility-owned assets, with utility-owned DER and generation, you often have reliable communications, field area networks, SCADA networks. They're communications that are ultimately under the control of the utility and tend to be highly reliable. In the customer space, on the other hand, it's often unreliable communications, right? It's the customer's internet is often used, or cellular connections, or whatnot, and they may go down. They're ultimately not under the control of the grid, and therefore need to be considered when these standards are written. Likewise, the equipment itself, when it's utility owned, it's owned by the utility. It's directly under their control. The objectives of the utility are the same as the objectives of the equipment, and they can configure the settings as they like. Whereas with customer-owned equipment, it's ultimately under the customer's control, right? They can often misconfigure something if they start playing around with it. They have different objectives perhaps than the grid itself. And so there's a difference there in terms of how it might operate. And then I mentioned the sales channels. So with utility-owned equipment, it's usually through a utility sales channel. It'll often come configured for that particular utility or where it's going to be installed, etc. Whereas customer-owned equipment, like I said, you could get it off of eBay or whatnot. And then lastly, the standards and protocols themselves. Usually with utility-owned equipment. Often in the US, you'll see DNP3. Often in other parts of the world, you'll see IEC 61850. But there tend to be these standards and protocols that are, I guess I should say, protocol standards that are specific for utility networks, for the utility use cases, and the ways those operate. Whereas in the customer-owned world, the only one I'm aware of that covers this area is IEEE 2030.5. So what is IEEE 2030.5? What are we aiming for with this standard? In general, we often call it the smart grid user interface. It's how customers interface communications-wise or protocol-wise with the smart grid or with the grid. It's designed using widely adopted technologies, and I like to emphasize that because that our kind of unofficial motto in the working group was "Don't be weird." And that becomes important because it allows for rapid development, rapid adoption, well-known libraries and software and things that folks can use to create the equipment. And it focuses on the communications between the grid, between utilities and outside entities like customers or consumers. So it's really the integration of those devices into the grid. It's meant to be secure. A lot of effort goes into the security, and a lot of security reviews have been done because obviously this is customer equipment. This is a protocol that crosses many boundaries. It's going out often over the internet, and it may even be used in places that are actively hostile. And so security becomes of great importance. It tends to serve two general purposes: informing the consumer, things like energy usage, pricing, etc., and then requesting actions to assist the grid. When it comes to DER, it'll be things like PV inverter controls, electric vehicle charging. There's also more demand response focused aspects like thermostat changes, set points, etc. And so it's really focused on this communication related to grid aspects, efficiency, usage, etc. And it's not meant to be, say, a home automation technology or protocol, but it is considered to be an IoT or Internet of Things profile. We went through and we selected a lot of very common protocols and technologies and put them together into a standard that ensures interoperability, and everyone has the kind of same options selected. We kept in mind that there's a range of backhaul technologies that can be used. It may be Wi-Fi, it may be Ethernet, it may be power line carrier, cellular, etc. And then lastly, there's some optimizations in there for embedded and battery-powered devices, because we recognize that these OEMs that are developing, say, inverters or electric vehicles, there may not be a lot of storage space or RAM, and they may in some cases even be battery powered, which seems a little strange when you're talking about things that are connected to the grid. But a lot of thermostats, just as an example, might be battery powered. So some of the functionality, just at a high level, you can see here on the screen. It's everything from just simple price communication and the so-called meter data, energy usage information, both generation and consumption, to more complex aspects like all of the controls and settings that are made available through IEEE 1547. All the various aspects that service providers might want to use for messaging, and then there's a number of things in there for prepayments, metering, and electric vehicles, and billing communication, which does differ slightly than price. Price is kind of what it costs for a given thing, but the bill is kind of what you get at the end of the month with all the taxes and the fees, etc. And then lastly, a simple way of doing file downloads and updates. So think there that you may want to use firmware updates or do security patches or things of that nature. Now for DER in particular, since I know that's probably what most of you are more interested in, the standard itself focuses on communications between the utility and individual, like consumers and smart inverters, as well as aggregators, which may or may not be used in some jurisdictions. And those aggregators can use between the aggregator and the consumer, as well as between the utility and the aggregator. And you can even have multiple levels of aggregators if you wanted. Obviously, there's support for both generation and storage, and an insane number of controls and curves and ratings and settings. And then for DER in particular, a lot of the other what we call function sets could be useful. So knowing how much energy is being produced or consumed and the price, etc. 2030.5 has some capabilities for grouping. And so if you look at how it's often used in by like a Durham system, they may group DER into groups based on the electrical network topology. So maybe all of the DER on the same feeder, for instance, could be in a group. And then, of course, it gives you that increased customer engagement and information. I mentioned that it's one of the 3 protocols in 1547, but we've also worked really hard to make certain that the information model, the actual bits and bytes that are transferred, are aligned with many other standards like SunSpec, like 1547, and like IEC 61850, so that there's not a lot of translation necessary. So I mentioned cybersecurity, but it's worth emphasizing how critical and important of a component cybersecurity is when it comes to a standard like 2030.5. Both security and privacy concerns are really paramount. And it's worth considering that cybersecurity attacks on the grid can have significant consequences in the physical world, right? You can overload transformers and things of that nature. And when it comes to a standard like 2030.5, being consumer focused, the design needs to operate with minimal consumer intervention, right? You can't have customers typing in passwords into their solar inverter. That's just not going to work. And so these need to be pretty much drop and go, no touch types of operations. And then you also have to consider that this is going to be part of a consumer's network as well. So first off, you can't be the the weak link, because you don't want the consumer to say, "Hey, this grid stuff I'm doing uh, hurt my network." But on the other hand, you've got to consider that the rest of the consumer network is likely or could be insecure or even actively hostile. They could have a weak Wi-Fi password, or who knows. And so, or the devices on the consumer's network may have viruses. And so there has to be a lot of thought given to operating in such a potentially hostile environment. There's also little to no physical protection. These are devices on the sides of buildings and the sides of houses. They're not inside of a protected substation, for instance. So a much different world than is traditional for the grid space. But on the other hand, unlike typical consumer devices, these devices need to last for decades. A solar inverter is going to last hopefully for quite a while. Same with a thermostat, or smart appliances, or things of that nature. Even a smart meter, they're going to be installed for quite a while, and so they have to be installed with technology, with cybersecurity technology and protocols that are very likely going to be still secure decades from now. And then, of course, from a standards perspective, we end up looking at a lot of cybersecurity guidelines and requirements from a lot of different governments and authorities and utilities, because there's just so many requirements out there that we're trying to meet them all, if you will, and so there's a lot of effort that goes into that, and a lot of reviews as well. Now, I mentioned it's an IoT profile, and I won't get into the bits and bytes too much unless there are questions later. But these are all kind of technologies that hopefully everyone is pretty familiar with, and you've probably, even if you're not a communications person, you've probably heard of or interacted with at some point in your life. So the internet protocol, that's just what lets you work on the internet. We use something called RESTful HTTP. This is just HTTP, the normal web protocol that you use for web browsing. We use TLS 1.2 for security, which is the same that you use for your online banking and things of that nature. So the little padlock in your web browser. The way the messages are formatted, we have two formats: XML, which is a very standard way of formatting messages, and then EXI, which is a compressed version of XML. We use, for a lot of the data model, we use the IEEE SIM, because once again, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. There's no reason to redefine everything if there's definitions that we can use. And then lastly, for things inside a premises to find one another and to discover services, we use XMDNS and DNSSD, which are protocols. These are the same things that say how your computer at home finds your printer on the network. So that's kind of a really rapid overview of 2030.5 itself. Now, in terms of status, we are working on a revision, or actually nearing completion of a revision right now. So the latest revision that's published is IEEE 2030.5 2018. So we've been actively working to revise that one essentially since 2018. IEEE P 2030.5 is an entity working group. There's two ways of standards development in IEEE. There are individual working groups and entity working groups. The biggest difference is the voting, right? So in individual working groups, you vote one vote per person. In entity working groups, it's one vote per entity, say one vote per company, for instance. Our PAR, which is our project authorization request, this is the thing that kicks off a new revision of a standard. It requires us to be backward compatible with the 2018 revision, which is quite important because there's a lot of ongoing deployments right now, and we wanted to assure the market that whatever we do in the next revision will still be backward compatible. There is one minor exception, and that's regarding minimum DER requirements. We actually kind of lowered the DER requirements because we found that there are some jurisdictions that that didn't need to support all of the controls that we had originally required. And then in terms of status, our second draft successfully passed both the working group ballot and the SA ballot. And during our SA ballot, we received about 50 comments. And so we're currently working to resolve those comments, and then we'll do a recirculation. So we're very much on track for publication this year. So be on the lookout for an IEEE 2030.5 2023. So what's changing, or what are we adding, and what's different? So some of the new enhancements we have, I'll get into these first two a little bit more in just a second. We have new aggregation functionality, as well as new proxy functionality, we call them. We also added a number of DER controls and some new DER behavior. We spent a lot of time trying to simplify the standard because despite all of our best efforts, it can still end up being complex. So we simplified and enhanced the way events are scheduled and how responses are handled, responses to those events. We did some updates to simplify device and service discovery. Because we had a requirement for backward compatibility, it really had us looking at how can we enhance support for backward and forward compatibility. We added some new elements to pricing, and as always, there's various issues that were corrected and clarifications that were made. So quite a number of changes, and something I think we're all going to be pretty proud of. Just to give you some terminology, I keep talking about aggregation, And I think I've defined that somewhat. And then proxy, we have this other concept of proxy, which is where a 2030.5 device may accept messages for another device and pass it on to another device that may or may not be a 2030.5 device. And so kind of one way to visualize that is and know the difference between aggregation and proxy is with this diagram here. You can see you've got, say, a utility server, probably a DERMS, that may be directly communicating with a DER, or it may be communicating with an aggregator. Now, the difference between aggregation and proxy, aggregation would have all of these DER with which the aggregator is communicating effectively look like one giant DER. They would be aggregated together. And that's often useful if you're wanting to, say, do virtual power plant activities or things of that nature. But on the other hand, proxying, even though the utility is only talking to this one aggregator server, the way proxying works is the aggregator server will present the information for all of these other DER. So even though the utility server isn't directly communicating with them, it is able to issue controls to each of those individual DER. So really the difference in both cases, you're going through another party, but in the one case, they're combined into one virtual device. In the other case, they're still presented separately. And so the newest revision will support both, because we know there are pros and cons to each approach, and there may be scenarios where you want to use one or the other. So I don't know that I need to get into this too much, but you should realize that all of this new functionality is, of course, optional. So it does optionally with the new aggregation functionality, you can optionally identify all the other devices that participate in the aggregation. You can specify a disaggregation strategy optionally. So you may say, I want it to be equally spread out amongst the members of the aggregation, or I may have some sort of priority on how the aggregation is disaggregated. But in the end, an aggregation of devices is treated the same way as single device is treated. It receives events. It can have what we call function set assignments, which are the groupings. And as far as anyone's concerned, it really just looks like one large device. Similarly, with the new proxy functionality, as I mentioned, it allows a device to proxy for other devices that may or may not be 2030.5 devices. It's similar to some functionality that's already used in something called CSIP, which I'll describe a little more in a moment. And it's a proxy device, once again, is treated the same way a single device is treated, with the exception of a few things, right, that require direct communications like subscriptions. But a device that is being proxied can receive events, it can have function set assignments, etc. So market adoption. So California, I think it's safe to say, led the way with their Rule 21. And then, of course, IEEE 1547 being published in 2018 really drove increased interest and activity in the US and elsewhere. But then now there are various pilots and activities globally. I think Australia, as an example, may have already surpassed California in terms of activity. I know 2030.5 is now a national standard in Australia, and there's a lot of good work and good activity going on there. There's interest in Canada and South Korea and many other places. And then I apologize if this is pretty US focused, but that's what I'm most familiar with. But there's something called FERC 2222 in the US, which allows aggregations to participate in markets. And so activities like that are going to further drive interest in IEEE 2030.5. I should note that the SunSpec Alliance does provide a certification program for 2030.5. and they currently are tracking 61 product lines that they've certified. IEEE does not track the implementations, but I think this is a pretty good indication that there's a number of companies that are out there developing products already. So, profiling activities. So there are several profiles of IEEE 2030.5 for specific use cases. So what do I mean by profiles? So as you heard, there's a number of different functions that are present in 2030.5. There's pricing, there's energy usage, there's electric vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. And so these profiles are developed by folks that say, hey, I have a very specific use case and I want to use 2030.5 for that use case. And here's how exactly I want to use it. So these profiles are compliant with 2030.5, and they simply provide guides for how to use it for these specific use cases. And they may provide additional requirements as well. So the first profile that was published is what's called CSIP, the Common Smart Inverter Profile. It was originally developed in California, where they're rolling out IEEE 2030.5 as the default protocol, and CSIP was a way of saying this is exactly how 2030.5 is going to be used for Rule 21 in California. And now there's also a CSIP Australia, which I believe is just became an Australian national standard as well. And it builds on CSIP and also includes some additional requirements for Australia. There's a SunSpec common metering profile. So this is primarily driven by smart meter deployments that include home area network functionality, where they want to enable, say, a smartphone to communicate directly with a smart meter and find out how much energy is being used or produced. And so there are smart meters being deployed today that have Wi-Fi, for instance, that support IEEE 2030.5. And then lastly, there's also what's called the V2G AC profile. So this is an implementation guide for another standard, which is SAE J3072. So SAE is the Society of Automotive Engineers, and they have a standard that mandates the use of IEEE 2030.5 for vehicle to grid. But it mandates the use, but it doesn't get into a lot of detail. So this profile describes exactly how to use it. So it's for electric vehicles to discharge into the grid, specifically AC, not DC, and exactly how to use 2030.5 to do that and meet interconnection requirements. And so that's the profiling activity. So one last thing I would like to highlight is if you do get a copy of IEEE 2030.5, and I certainly encourage it, I just wanted to highlight that there's two artifacts that really comprise the standard. There's the typical Word document or PDF or whatever that you get from IEEE that you purchase. But there's also an associated zip file that's available at standards.ieee.org/downloads. And that contains a whole host of documents that are quite useful, two of which are normative. The two that are normative are the XML schema itself, so that defines the objects for the protocol, and then the WADL, which defines kind of the access permissions or how you access those objects. So I just wanted to highlight that if you do go and you get a copy of the standard, I encourage you to also get a copy of this zip file because it does include normative information and it's quite useful. There's an HTML rendering of a UML model that you can see how the objects are organized. There's a number of examples that are present in the document, but these examples are also available in the zip file so that you can manipulate them and use them and better understand them, etc. So with that, I've included also a number of useful links here to those download materials that I just mentioned, to the various profiles, a link to the list of certified products, etc. That I'm sure we'll figure out how to distribute to you. And so I do thank you for your attention and your time, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Mamadou. Thank you, Robby. Great presentations from both, and I think we are on track with the time. We have had some challenges with the chat and Q&A, but once again, I want to reiterate, people want to post questions. So there is a Slido that's opened up, and slido.com, you can go and you can put the attendee code, which is 2519603. I'm just going to put it in the chat window again before I go and take up the questions that we have received. A couple of them we have received until now. So with that, the first question is from Peter Kilby to Mamadou. So the question goes, what requirements of IEEE 1547 have been identified that interfere with GFM capabilities? That's to you, Mamadou.
Yeah, sure.
Do you want me to repeat the question, Mamadou?
Yeah, can you repeat it again?
What requirements of IEEE 1547 have been identified that interfere with GFM capabilities?
Okay. If I'm understanding correctly, the question is about what exactly we trying to fix that interfere with the grid forming inverter. So
Right.
That's a great question. I don't have it on top of my head. I probably will need to dig a little bit further because it's a list of several pages of stuff that we're looking into. I would say several tabs of Excel document with a lot of information. I don't have it on top of my head, but typically it's just a language that something like when you say that the utility cannot allow DER to recreate, to create simulate the grid while the utility is not present. Things like that. There are languages like that. Sometimes maybe just a matter of changing a shall or may or shall not into may. Some kind of language like it may not be something that's significant to and that's based on my recollection. But it's just a minor adjustment on how the language is written such that it doesn't say if you are not a utility, you cannot do something. So something like that. But again, I don't have on top of my head exactly what language it is. I will have to dig a little deeper, which will take me a little more time because it's just a lot of document to sort through. Yeah.
No worries. So please send me any information you get, Mamadou, and I will reach out to Peter and provide that response.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
That would be good. Yeah. Thank you.
So then there is one other one from Peter on 2030.5. That's for Robby. And that is, can IEEE 2030.5 use pub sub MQTT messaging?
Great question, Peter. So I guess the short answer is no, MQTT is not included in IEEE 2030.5. The longer answer is that IEEE 2030.5 does include its own pub sub capability that's built on top of HTTP. There's a few reasons why we went that direction. One being that because there was already a use of HTTP and we were targeting embedded devices, we were afraid of using too many protocols. The second is that there were some concerns with firewalls when it came to using MQTT. MQTT has matured since then, so maybe it doesn't have as many firewall issues as it did when we originally developed 2030.5. But for all of these reasons, we essentially implemented a pub sub type mechanism. We call it subscription notification messaging on top of 2030 on top of HTTP in 2030.5. But yeah, great question.
Thank you. And the next one is also a very interesting question from, it says, Robby. So to you, Robby, how does 2030.5 fit with open ADR? This is a question we get often. So
Yeah, we often get this question. So yeah, good question. So it really depends on the use case. So OpenADR, as you can probably tell from the name, is really focused on demand response. And so when it comes to a lot of what we've discussed today with DER, particularly like DER controls and settings and curves and ratings, to my knowledge, OpenADR does not support that. OpenADR tends to focus purely on the demand response aspects. So in that sense, there is some overlap between the two standards on demand response, because 2030.5 is, also also supports demand response. So, I'll leave it to to you all to decide how they fit together. I've certainly seen cases where some folks will use OpenADR to a certain system and then use 2030.5 from that system down to the edge. I've seen other cases where people think they're competitive and just want to use one or the other. So I leave it to you all to determine the best way to utilize these standards.
thank you, Robby. This is a question perhaps for both of you from my side, if I may, as we are waiting for a few other questions. But something that I focus on within the practice of foundational technologies is building trust in systems. And you may have covered it in your talk, but I would want you to throw some light on that. Cybersecurity is becoming very critical. Any technology we take, we kind of get concerned about cybersecurity. And especially when you talk about products and software that are going to affect the utilities, they are even more shy. They are very concerned about how this will impact their society, their community, right? So can you throw some light on what exactly is being done from a cybersecurity perspective, perhaps first from the communication side, Robby, and then from the interconnectivity side from Mamadou? Thank you.
Sure. So yeah, from the communication side, we put a lot of effort into thinking about cybersecurity with IEEE 2030.5. So it's built using TLS 1.2 for a couple of reasons. One, it goes back to our unofficial motto, if you will, don't be weird. We didn't want to invent our own security protocol or anything like that. But there's also a lot of danger in inventing your own security protocol. The TLS 1.2 is something that has been really hammered in the wider internet community and really well understood. And so we're frankly standing on the shoulders of those giants. And then um, for the devices themselves, both the servers and the clients, they all require certificates, and these are using cipher suites that are considered state of the art. It requires the use of mutual authentication. There's a lot of language in the standard around access control. Just a tremendous amount of effort has gone into providing cybersecurity mechanisms. And then lastly, of course, just the ability to do updates, right? Because um, there's whether or not the standard is secure itself, and then there's the devices, the implementations.
That's right.
And while we feel very confident that the standard is secure because it's been through so many reviews and by a lot of interesting government agencies and whatnot, um, the implementations themselves can always have issues as well. And so that's why we make certain to have mechanisms for providing updates and things like that. Good question.
Thank you. Thank you. And Mamadou, anything from the perspective of the interconnectivity to the grid?
That's a great question, Sri. On the interconnection side, cybersecurity is something that's very big concern for the utility as well, and also because especially with the increase in penetration of DERs to the power system, if anyone is able to use the interconnection as a backdoor to get into another system, like for instance, utility system, this is a concern for us. So one thing that on the 1547 level we've been trying to do is make sure that DER equipment abide to the same standard that everyone else who is using the best cybersecurity practices. Just to abide by the same standard, just not have them treated differently than anyone else. So that's one thing that we're trying to do, make sure they use the best practices, and also have regulators also embrace the same thing, because by adopting the 1547 standard, they will make it a requirement for those DER to meet the same standard. That's one thing that we do. And then also having also one way for us to, in the standard, to check if there's any change that potentially could affect the reliability of that DER, having some clause that will allow us to do regularly some checking, some verification on site to make sure that everything is actually doing exactly as it is expected. So that means doing some interconnection testing, witness testing, redoing it every now and then. It may not be every 5 years, 10 years, maybe every 2 years, or every time a change is made, just to make sure that we check all the I's and dot all the T's. And again, everything is working as supposed. And again, this is something that we'll be putting in the standard for 1547.3 and bringing it back to the main standard to make sure it is something that everyone abide by. That's actually what we're doing on the 1547 area.
Perfect. Thank you, Mamadou. There are a couple of comments, and I will read those comments. I don't think there's a specific question there, but somebody has highlighted some of the efforts in South Australia. So this is from Professor Keith Kickert. In South Australia, the SIP has become mandatory for all solar inverters installed since 1st July to allow networks to control dynamic export limits from 1.5 kilowatt to 10 kilowatt per phase. South Australia often has more rooftop solar than the state demand in a nearly isolated grid with just 700 megawatt linked to the other states. And I think to overlay on that comment, Daniel has mentioned that from 1st July, all solar inverters must have the export limits capable to be controlled by remote control by the network provider. So very interesting comments there. So anything, do you want to add, one of you want to add to those comments, or?
Just
On the
I'm thrilled to see the adoption.
Yeah, go ahead, Robby. You go first.
I was just going to say that I'm thrilled to see the adoption of IEEE 2030.5 in Australia, and a lot of good work that's gone on there, and a lot of good participation in the 2030.5 working group. There's we get a lot of good insights, and the next revision that's coming out was heavily influenced by participants from Australia.
Perfect. And Mamadou?
For me, what I wanted to, just to add to what Robby mentioned, I'm really happy also to see that, because that's one of the requirements that we have in 1547, to have some of those capability. You can ramp up, but we want you also to be able to ramp down. But a lot of time, the ramping down may require having an energy storage to be able to do that. That way you're able to safeguard or at least store that energy for later use. Those are some of the requirements that we put in 1547 to make sure that everyone is able to support the grid when it's needed. And just like Australia is saying, you may have more supply than demand. What if now later on that supply and demand reverse now, the way it used to be? You have to be able to have all those functionality. That's what the 1547 2018 standard was bringing to the table, making a requirement. So I'm very happy to see that this is going to be useful there.
Perfect. Definitely in a lot of places we are having a energy surplus, right, market. So that's very interesting. So I don't see any comments or hands raised. I just want to make a couple of final remarks before I hand it over to Sanjay and Daniel. The first remark is, I know that during the introductions, I didn't introduce myself. So I thought to close the loop, I will come back and introduce myself. Some of you might have heard me in the first webinar. I'm Sri Chandra from the IEEE. I'm a staff of the IEEE. I currently run the business operations of the IEEE in the India office, but I also, for the Standards Association, I lead a foundational technologies practice, and smart grid is one of the core elements of what I call under the IoT umbrella. So we look at building trust in systems, so whether it's end-to-end devices or the complete systems, focused around not only just cybersecurity, but identity, privacy, and few of the other factors on the horizontal level. And I have my peers who look at specific practices on the verticals like healthcare, mobility, telecom and connectivity and so on and so forth. The second plug I'm going to make is for people who have colleagues or friends or people who are interested in this domain based out of Seoul, Korea. We are running a roundtable / workshop on the 18th of July in Seoul at the Grand Hyatt. And Robby will be hosting that workshop focused around 2030.5. We have had about 20 people who have been very interested, but I'm sure if there are others, they can certainly sign up and we can accommodate them. So please reach out to Sanjay or through me. I will post my email address on the chat window before we sign off, and they can reach out to me. And if you think that it will be valuable for somebody from that region, we have also got attendees from Japan who are joining, so it's very interesting. So before I hand it over, I just saw that there is a question from Peter Kilby. Are there any IEEE 1547 compliant EV? Is the SunSpec V2G_AC profile intended to operate between utility and EV or between EV and EVSE? Maybe Robby, you can take that. There is aspects of that around that, but Mamadou also. Go ahead.
Sure, I'll take a stab, and then Mamadou, of course, if you have anything to add, please feel free.
No problem. Go ahead.
As far as compliant EVs go, I'm not certain. I do know that there are EVs that are capable of vehicle to grid activities, so of discharging into the grid. Whether or not they're 1547 compliant, I'm not certain. I believe it is the view of most regulators that I've talked to that for vehicle to grid to take place, they will need to be compliant with interconnection standards like 1547, because essentially especially when they're discharging with AC, the inverter is essentially built into the vehicle. So in some ways, it is a 1547 type device, but I'm not sure about the compliance. Now for the vehicle to grid AC profile, it touches a little bit on both utility, but the utility to EVSE as well as EVSE to EV, but primarily focuses on EVSE to EV communications, because the view is that the EVSE will be kind of the gatekeeper, if you will, for the interconnection. So essentially, the EV connects. It says it wants to discharge, and it waits for authorization to discharge from the EVSE after exchanging a lot of the settings and parameters and controls. But this is still a draft. I don't think it's finished yet. So stay tuned or better yet, participate, because there's a lot of interesting activities going there. And I think this space in particular, EVs and vehicle to grid, is rapidly evolving. But in my opinion, this profile is one of the areas where there's a lot of interesting work going on right now, and really kind of to use a car analogy, lifting up the hood and figuring out exactly what needs to take place for an electric vehicle to safely interconnect and discharge into the grid.
Thank you, Robby. Mamadou?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you, Robby. Again, to my knowledge, again, I was in that field too for about 2 years, where I tried to test out some V2G equipment to make sure that they meet at least a minimum utility requirement. What I know of is that inverters individually as an equipment, under test, when they get tested, they try to be compliant to 1547. But where it becomes difficult is you have to be acting as a load when you need to, when you're charging, and then you have to discharge and become a generator when you're trying to push power out into the grid. So that it's just that there's that gray line, a very gray line, where it's hard to dissociate those two functions. What I've seen so far is that the utility or the V2G industry is really struggling with that. That's where actually 1547 is trying to bring all the great mind together and try to figure out how do you dissociate those. Because if for instance, you have a Just let me give you just an example of an electric school bus, which in my territory here in the United States, we have a lot of those. Those school buses have 220 kilowatt hours battery in them, and they're using VTG DC, not AC. So the inverter is outside, really somewhere in a fixed platform. When those school buses are coming and connecting and discharging, they need to be ready to take students back to school or from home to school. If you don't allow them to connect and you follow strictly what 1547 is doing as it stands now, those school buses will never be charged enough to be ready and then take the students back home when it's time. So that's the gray line. You have to make sure that the requirement doesn't become a barrier to some functionality that are critical, and then it's also able to provide support to the grid when it needs to. Or if they want to do B2H, to just be able to power your home. How do you make sure that it does that safely, reliably? That's where the industry, especially the V2G and inverter manufacturer for EVs, are struggling. They're learning about the power system. They're learning about some of those requirements, and they're trying to educate us, like we also trying to educate them in that, so that we can find a middle ground where we can. So I would say the answer is it depends, and it's very complicated, and it's not there yet, but hopefully we'll be there soon.
Thank you, Mamadou. So I think we have probably come pretty much to the end of this session. We have about 3 or 4 minutes left. As both Robby and Mamadou indicated, these works are under draft for the upcoming revision. If anybody is interested in providing their views or participating, I recommend the best way to do that is directly sign up for the working groups and provide your inputs. I think they will be greatly beneficial. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sanjay. All right. So.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. So we have just come to the end of the very excellent webinar. That's on the IEEE standards related to distributed energy. It started with Mamadou, Dr. Mamadou, giving an overview of IEEE 1547, and he mentioned that he was associated with it for the last 10 years, starting from 2012. It started from drafting and why standard is important. He spoke on 1547.3, that's guide on cybersecurity, which is very important in the current scenario because you have the interconnected grids, and that's very much a part of the smart grid. And he's basically leading the entire 1547 team to the future revision that's due in 2026, on which he started working. We moved on to Dr. Simpson, who basically shared his views on IEEE 2030. He spoke on DE ownership, that's utility control and customer control, what are the requirements, smart grid, DER communication, which is of paramount importance, interface between the smart grid and the operator and the customer, and that's also due for revision, and he's working on it. Thank you very much, both the speakers, basically from R10 Talk team. I thank you from the core of my heart and the entire Talk team. And we will have the next webinar on R10 panel on climate change that's coming on 29 July and R10 training climate change that's coming on 30th July. Maybe there will be some changes in between. We can have some other speakers that is coming up of 22nd. So please tune to us, keep us tuned with us, and we will share it with you. Moderator, thank you, Mr. Sikand Chandrasekhan, for moderating the session.
Thank you.
Participants, you can give your feedback by scanning the QR code. And from the Industry Relations Committee, Professional Activities Committee, of which Daniel Egbal is there, Young YP team, Humanitarian, we, and Student Activities and Life member, we thank you all. So we come to the end. Can we have our cameras on so we can have a group photograph, please?
Absolutely. Hey, Robby and Mamadou. Okay, perfect.
Can we have the group photograph?
Just give me a second. I'm also plugged.
Yes. You can also have it.
I took one from my side, okay?
It's okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
We'll meet you
Thank you.
next
Everyone.
Okay.
soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.